So you might want to have handy for a little bit later the blue insert. It's called Sermon Notes. And these are for you, but really I write them for me to kind of stay on target so I don't get off into the, ethereal space. So you can see how well this helps me stay on track. So Richard Rohr, the Franciscan spiritual writer and guru and founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation, recently wrote that our faith story is a story of great love and great suffering. Great love and great suffering. So he describes these two forces intimately related to one another, challenging, calling forth, and shaping our faith. If faith, as Luther says, is a mighty living active thing, how are we living by faith in the love and the suffering of our lives? He notes that suffering, Richard Rohr notes that suffering can lead to shutting down, to bitterness and resentment, or it can draw us by faith closer to God. Are you with me? Okay. A little hesitating nodding of heads, okay. Today, Jesus uses a shocking image in the gospel. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I've scratched my head about that a lot. Could it be that he was describing his own great love and great suffering, and that he already wanted to have it completed? I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and how I long for it to be over. Today we consider how our faith, a mighty living active thing, is born and shared in the great love and the great suffering of Jesus Christ, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. So as I reflected on Rohr's insight, I began to discern that faith is like the muscle between great love and great suffering. It is born and developed and exercised in this tension of love and suffering. And I want to share a bit of my personal story to illustrate. And I want to invite you to think about this in terms of your own struggle with love and suffering. So as many of you know, my wife suffers from dementia. And as her partner of over 50 years, I share in that suffering too. I co-suffer with her. It's not Alzheimer's, but it's frontotemporal dementia, which I'm still learning about. She can't drive or write a check or do household chores. She lives in an increasingly smaller world of TV and mostly sitcoms and brief outings. She repeats the same things over and over, like captions to pictures she's remembering. Dove Lewis really saved our dignity when he ate all those ibuprofen. That's a story, huh? We used to go to that place when it was a Burgerville, and so forth. Frankly, I'm grieving the loss of my wife, who is still here, but not present as she used to be. That's the great suffering part. Well, let me stop right there and say it's a stretch to call it great suffering. I'm well aware that there are many, including people in this room, who suffer much greater, let alone those in Ukraine or starving children. My point only is to own my own experience of suffering as a crucible in which the Spirit is working. My suffering is great suffering because it is my suffering, okay? As Rohr goes on to say, suffering often takes us to the very edge of our inner resources where we, quote, fall into the hands of the living God by faith. So I'm reflecting now, as I said earlier, that the muscle of faith is exercised in the crucible of great love and great suffering. So this is why I tell you a part of my story. That said, I'm not alone or isolated. I have my congregation. I have a monthly dementia support group. I go to a 12-step meeting. I have a prayer group. I have family and friends who are helping along the way. And I still suffer, okay? So as I reviewed the reading for today, the Hebrews reading, this great chapter about faith in Hebrews 11, I saw two sides to the faith story of our ancestors. Not everyone in the story gets out unscathed or even alive. Did you notice that? So I developed a little chart, and that's what I want you to look at on the back of the sermon notes. On the one hand and on the other, from Hebrews 11. On the one hand, by faith, our ancestors conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, won strength out of weakness, etc., etc. That's the positive side, right? At about halfway through the lesson, however, it says, on the other hand, or others, it says others suffered mocking and flogging. Others suffered chains and imprisonment. Others were stoned to death, were sawn in two, were killed by the sword. Which side of the columns do you want to be on? Pretty clear, right? And isn't it interesting? On the left-hand column, some escaped the edge of the sword, and on the right side, some were killed by the sword. And it doesn't mean that those who were killed by the sword had more or less faith. That faith isn't in the outcome, but faith is in the journey, in embracing both the suffering and the love that God has put before us. Clearly, our forebears lived by faith in great love and great suffering, sometimes overcoming and sometimes being overcome. Are you with me? Are you catching this? Are you thinking about it? Okay. All the time, being held in the hands of a living and loving God. So a couple months ago, I was getting down about my situation with my wife. It was wearing on me. I was letting it get to me, and I had reached the end of my rope. It was not bitterness or resentment that I battled, though I could see that there was a slippery slope to that. Rather, it was incessant worry about the future. What's going to happen next? What if I can't take care of her anymore? And it was also sadness and grief. Okay, I was feeling a little sorry for myself. Okay. What in Al-Anon they call dwelling on the train wreck of the future. Isn't that an image? So when we sit down to dinner, she wants 60s music, but I only fix her a little dinky deal. That's what she calls it, because she doesn't eat very well, most of which she leaves untouched. And after 3 minutes, she says, I'm going to go watch TV. And every time she leaves the table, my heart sinks. I remember how each Sunday, as part of our meal in worship, we say, lift up your hearts. And we lift them to the Lord. And I need that. I need that. So one morning a couple months ago, I woke up with a nudge from the Spirit. She seemed to whisper in my ear, "Why don't you write about this?" So I began a journal called These Days. And I just tried to describe what I was experiencing, my thoughts and my feelings and worries and hopes. And in the midst of this, what really is, in the scheme of things, puny suffering, I discovered great love. I felt like I loved her more in some ways now than ever before. Something I could not explain. This simple remembering lifted my heart. It was in this period that we began to make a daily pilgrimage to the Dairy Queen on Southeast 174th and Stark in my Southeast neighborhood, in the heart of Rockwood, which is a neighborhood notorious for poverty and crime and many shootings. One of the signs we pass, and this is not really a welcome sign. We were talking about welcoming people here, right? But it says, "Steal gas, get shot, armed tenants." I'm not moving to that apartment building. But the fact is, for the last 55 days, you can count them, 55 days in a row, yes, every day we have driven to Dairy Queen, about 12 minutes from our home. She orders a small vanilla cone, and I have a small hot fudge sundae. On the way there and back, she says, "Can we put tunes on in the car?" And I put my playlist on of old 60s music, twist and shout, and I want to dance with somebody. And she starts moving her arms and singing along, and so I can't help it. I have to drive too, but I'm singing along with her. And she starts, as she sings along with the Beatles or Whitney Houston, it's as if to say, "I'm alive. I'm still here, honey. I want to sing and dance." As I was writing this sermon, I remembered a passage earlier in the same chapter of Luke 12. Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear, for life is more than food and the body more than..." Have you heard this? More than clothing. "Consider the ravens, they neither toil nor reap. They neither have storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Are you not of more value than birds? And can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your lifespan?" I needed that. I need that word. I need that sacrament. So we're writing some of our stories on the St. Andrew timeline, and it's great to see some of the stories that are written up there. They're likely to be more like captions, like my wife is recalling as on our way to Dairy Queen, but there's much more underneath those captions. These are stories of our faith, the muscle between great suffering and great love. And Dairy Queen, of all places in Rockwood, has become a kind of sanctuary for us. The servers all know us when we come, often preparing our order before we get through the door, and when we leave saying, "See you tomorrow." And indeed, often they do. In a way, it has become a sacrament for us. You know, the confirmation definition of sacrament, an earthly sign of a heavenly promise. In this case, the ice cream and the service is an earthly sign. And the promise is the great love that it manifests, even in this place. The car ride, the singing, the dancing, the mighty, living, active thing happening in our midst. Let us lay aside every weight that clings to us and run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Amen.